This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers Lecture 7 in Seminar 3. In the last video, we considered the difference between the discourse of psychosis in poetry and the specific manner by which Schreber's delusions took hold. We noted a difference between how God functions in Schreber's world in contrast to that of the neurotic, in which God can function on the symbolic plane as big other. For the most part, psychosis was approached by consideration of the symbolic and the lack thereof. Today we're going to approach psychosis predominantly in view of the imaginary. And so the following questions are addressed. 1. How are the drives and ego in conflict? 2. Why is the name of the Father important for regulating the imaginary? And 3. How does Schreber undergo an imaginary dissolution? We begin Lecture 7 by returning to Freud's well-known case study of Dora. Lacan turns to this case as an example of neurosis that contrasts with the essential features of psychosis. This case is helpful because Dora, though not psychotic, does exhibit some delusional features. In this case, Frau K., the wife of Herr K., becomes the persecutory object. However, the object relationship with Frau K. as Dora's imaginary alter ego or little other, along with the rivalrous relationship with her father, a relation Freud fails to recognize, remains structured by the symbolic. We're not merely dealing with an imaginary relation of two, but the third enters into play here. The symbolic father who resides across three figures, the actual father, Herr K., and Freud himself. As such, we have here a case of hysteria rather than psychosis. Lacan also adds that one of the defining features of psychosis is a disorder of language, something that we don't observe in the case of Dora. Now, though a disorder of language is a defining feature, the heart of the problem in psychosis is narcissism. Lacan defines narcissism here as the central imaginary relation that pertains to interhuman interactions. It's a fundamentally erotic relation, a seizing of the other that is at the same time the basis for aggressive tensions. This relation gives rise to the formation of the ego that represents a duality internal to the subject, since the ego is always already an other. Consequently, the ego is partly foreign to the subject, a master implanted into the heart of the subject and giving rise to an aggressive, rivalrous relation that is internalized within the subject itself. The central conflict then for the subject is between the drives and the ego. In Lacan, the drives are not some ultimate given, something archaic and primordial, as he will discuss in Seminar 11, but rather the drives are thoroughly structured by the symbolic. Now, in its synthesizing function, the ego adopts some of these drives, but not others. And so the synthesizing function of the ego is a synthesis by exclusion. The ego creates a sense of completeness by excluding that which is unacceptable. As such, Lacan states the function of the ego is more accurately characterized by mastery, since a genuine synthesis never truly takes place. Lacan then asks, where is this master? Is it inside or outside of us? And indeed, it is both, since the ego is essentially an other. And this gives rise to a fundamental instability between inside and outside, an instability that, without the structuring influence of the law, forms the basis of psychosis. Lacan compares humans to bumper cars in this lecture, which encapsulates something fundamental in human beings. Bumper cars are intended to aggressively knock into others on the track. Often there can be this situation where so many bumper cars aggressively knock into one another that they end up all smashed together, unable to move. This is analogous to imaginary relations, relations that are instinctual and doomed for conflict. To keep the flow of traffic, to keep from everyone crashing into one another to the point that all movement stops, there requires some basic function that maintains a distance among vehicles so that even should they bump into one another on occasion, there's enough sense to not go all the way with it, and instead disengage right away. According to Lacan, this is the meaning of the Oedipus complex, the third party, which installs an image of success and a model for harmony within the imaginary relation. It's the imposition of a law that intervenes to prevent complete collapse. For the subject, this law operates on the order of speech and is what Lacan, for the first time in these seminars, I believe, calls the name of the Father. Now, at this point, he doesn't elaborate much on this phrase, but adds that the name is not dependent upon living existence and is not derived from animal life. Instead, it extends and perpetuates itself beyond that life, and it's what distinguishes the human from the animal. For this reason, when we find a skeleton in a grave, we immediately call it human. A grave is a symbolic perpetuation of the subject beyond the organism's death. And this is how the name functions. It subsists outside the subject, both distinct from and determinative of existence. Lacan then returns to the case of Schreber. As psychotic, we don't have that governing influence of the law and the name that can stabilize the relation between inside and outside. Consequently, there is an imaginary invasion of subjectivity and a predominance of the mirror relationship. Hence why at the beginning of this video, I mentioned that Lacan thinks of psychosis primarily in terms of his understanding of narcissism, which, to be clear for those who are less acquainted with Lacan, is very different than the notion of narcissism that you find, say, in the DSM and the way it's used today in modern psychology. For Schreber, there's also a dissolution of the other as identity. As such, we find the ego of Schreber dispersed among a whole series of characters that are ever shifting and fragmenting, from the fleeting improvised men to the souls that become corpses, to Schreber, the subject himself, who becomes other to himself, even claiming that he has died and that there's a copy of him. These imaginary others have identities and a sense of agency that penetrates, inhibits, and divides Schreber in an uncontrolled and uncontrollable manner. And so there's not a third mediating the imaginary relation. There's only the you that remains. The you is the imaginary other who is at the same time the me. When I speak of another who is not present, I bring them into presence by evoking their name. But the you addresses who is already present, who is not distant enough to become an invisible overseer of present relations. We might notice this effect in stories. When the narrator speaks in the third person, we can more clearly see what they see. But when the narrator and a main character are one and the same, such that when they narrate, they also speak to other characters at the same time, we as readers have a much harder time coming to terms with what is truly happening, as the narrator becomes much more unreliable. Perhaps we can see an equivalent to this in the films Memento and Fight Club, in which we, as an audience, are deprived of a third-person perspective for most of the film until the end, and so find ourselves in the confusing flow of experiences that the main characters find themselves in. So perhaps these narrative examples are giving us an analogous glimpse into what Lacan is trying to demonstrate here with regards to the imaginary dissolution seen in Psychosis. I want to thank the following for supporting this channel on Patreon. If you wish to support this work on Patreon, the link is below in the description. You can also support this work by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, be well.